In Superior, Wisconsin, on the corner of North 6th and Hammond, there stands an old abandoned wreck of a building. Once upon a time, it was a synagogue. Agudas Achim was built in 1896, Wisconsin's second oldest synagogue. Much of Superior's once strong Jewish population came here. Now the synagogue belongs to vagabonds and neighborhood kids, and occasionally, as singed by campfires, people have lit inside. Agudas Achim won't stand much longer. It was the last of the city's two synagogues. But some families are still here, as they are on Minnesota's Iron Range and in Duluth. For although buildings may come and go, the Jewish heritage around Lake Superior's western shore remains. On Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, the start of the faith's high holy days, Phil Mizell blows the shofar, the ram's horn. The sound of the shofar is a call to gather the people together. The shofar has been heard in the Northland for well over a century. It was heard over lakes and pine forests, mine pits and logging camps. Jews were here long ago. Many came to find a future for themselves and their families. Many escaped terror in Europe to start a new life in a new land. Many started out poor and hungry, but their children often became men and women of means. It is a Jewish history, a story of survival and of tradition, of communities bound by faith and of blessings from above. How did it all start? Who were the first Jews in the Northland? No one's really sure. The first record of a Jew settling here comes from LaPointe on Wisconsin's Madeline Island. Not much is known about Julius Austrian, but he landed on Madeline Island, an outpost of the American frontier, in 1842, making his living as a trader and storekeeper. He married and held high holy day services on the island, and went on to become quite well-to-do, investing in Ashland iron mines and in land that would someday become Duluth, Minnesota. Julius became an agent for the native community on the island and was responsible for the preservation of the Indian grave sites there. But Julius Austrian wouldn't stay at LaPointe. He and his wife would eventually move down to St. Paul and become known for their benevolence towards the poor and destitute. A quarter of a century later, the Northland was no longer an undeveloped backwater. Duluth and Superior became shipping towns, business towns, prosperous towns. People came in droves to seek their fortunes here. Bernard Silberstein came too. This immigrant from Budapest would become Duluth's first permanent Jewish settler.
He is my great-grandfather. He is my mother's grandfather. When he was about 22 years old, he came to Duluth just to look around, to see what it would be like to live. Apparently, he had an urge to leave Detroit, and I don't know why, but he wanted to leave Detroit. He came to Duluth, looked around, and liked it. And he returned to Detroit, and during the 2 years between 1868 and 1870, he met his future wife, and he was married in 1870 and brought his bride to Duluth on a steamship on their honeymoon. And he stayed. He was a very outgoing kind of personality. He loved people. He loved dealing with people. He apparently had the itch to move and found that Duluth was a place to go.
Bernard Silberstein started his life in Duluth in 1870 as a peddler. Within a year, he and his wife Nettie saved enough money and opened a store selling dry goods and linens and women's clothing. By the 1920s, it was one of the largest clothing stores in Duluth.
And so he ultimately became you know, a commissioner of town, and that was an accomplishment. You know, a Jewish man becoming a commissioner in the city of Duluth.
Other Jews soon followed Bernard Silberstein's footsteps. There were Freemouths and Leopolds, Bondys and Hellers. Some opened shops and even started the area's first synagogue, Duluth's Temple Emmanuel. Those first were Jews from Germany and Hungary. Many came from European middle-class families or had made their mark in America already. They were also Reform Jews, not adhering strictly to the faith. They kept their shops open on the Sabbath. They didn't keep kosher. But Reform Jews would quickly become a minority by the turn of the century. A great exodus was beginning in the far corners of Eastern Europe. From small villages in Poland, Lithuania, and Russia they came. Refugees, Orthodox Jews, from a region called the Pale of Settlement.
So the Russians wanted to keep the Jews out of Mother Russia, so they formed an area out of land that they had conquered that was called the Pale of Settlement. That was really between Poland and Mother Russia, primarily incorporating areas of what is today Lithuania and Poland. And the Jews were forced to live in either shtetls, or if there were towns in these areas, there would be ghetto areas that would be in a separate part of the town. So the Jews were kept separate from their Christian neighbors.
We lived in a little village, you probably never heard of it, called Wilkomirski. Maybe there was 12, 15 families there. The Cossacks they lived up in the mountains. They were from, they were the elite army of the Tsar. But they were very anti-Semitic. And when they would go through a Jewish village, they would ransack, rape, and pillage, and we used to hide in Gentiles' homes.
Many of these Jews scraped for food and money. There was persecution, and now and then, war came through the Pale. First the Germans, then the Bolsheviks. The Jews were always caught in the middle.
The Tsar would take all of the Jewish men of the family, except for one. He would always leave one breadwinner behind. Otherwise, he'd leave behind a woman and children, which the state would have to take care of. And put him into military service for 25 years. And of course, in those days, it's hand-to-hand combat. No planes, no trains, no automobiles. So 25 years of hand-to-hand combat generally meant you'd never come back. You'd never be seen again.
I remember during pogroms and little wars that were between the White Russians and the Red Russians, the Bolsheviks and the Germans, they all passed through our villages. And after the battle was over, which is actually a skirmish, the kids would go outside, kids like myself, 7, 8 years old, 6 years old, and we take their shoes off from the dead soldiers that were laying on the street. We take their jackets off, their hats, their caps off, and look through their pockets. If there was any food laying around that they had in their bags, we take it and run home with it, because that was the way we survived.
My father, who was a reservist in the Russian army, fled Russia in 1913 because they already were talking of the possibility of hostilities. And he knew if he stayed there, they'd call him up right away.
Didn't take a lot of money to come to America. You have to remember, in the 19th century, our nation was recruiting immigrants. We needed people. This country needed people. They needed bodies. We were, our frontier was expanding westward. We had all of these empty spaces. There were actually people in Europe from America recruiting folks to leave. And it would cost you very little, $50 maybe, to get on that ship and come to America. It wasn't a great expense.
So the men left. They left their wives and their children and traveled alone and came to America. Many arrived in the big cities on the East Coast and stayed with the growing Jewish communities there. There were organized immigrant societies, some of them Jewish societies, that directed new immigrants to points out west, dispersing the Jewish population. The Twin Ports were one point. But once the Jews came to the Midwest alone in a strange land, What kind of work was there to do? They had no skills in logging or mining.
But they could become peddlers. That was something they were used to doing, selling, being the middleman. And when these towns are opening up here in the Midwest, up in the Northland, up on the Iron Range, you had miners and you had the company operators. You needed somebody in between because miners needed clothing, miners needed supplies, and the Jewish merchant fit right in there.
My dad came over when he first came over, and he bought a horse and a little wagon, and they called them draymen. They'd pick up baggage from maybe the depot and deliver things, and they make maybe 50 cents a day. He saved enough money for a year, and then my mother came.
So he had an uncle in Duluth, a Mr. Mark. So he came to his uncle in Duluth, and he started as a peddler, and he was doing very well and saving every dime, and eventually he brought his sons over. And after they came over, they earned money too and saved it. They saved enough so that by 1890 he could bring over all of his rest of his family.
They saved their money and sent for the others. That's the way it was with all the families that came here.
Isidore Crystal's father spent the war years in America. By 1920, after peddling goods, cleaning horses, cleaning railway cars, he was finally able to bring his family over. Isidore was 9.
And we went through Poland, Germany, into France, and then from France, in Le Havre, France, we took a boat, and we crossed the ocean in 2 weeks. It took us 2 weeks to cross the ocean to get to New York.
We took the ship in Rotterdam. I'll never forget the name, the Holland American line, the Rotterdam. We were in 4th steerage. The cattle were 1 floor above us. When we got into Ellis Island, they had long, long tables full of food. You know, cake and bread and jelly and jams and peanut butter, and we never saw any of that stuff because white bread in Europe, where we lived, was like having the finest cake in the world. Yeah, it was July 4th when we got in there, and before we got off of the boat to have examinations, they were celebrating the 4th with firecrackers and all these things that, you know, exploded in the air, and my mother cried and said, "My God, we just left a war and we're in another one."
Think of what these folks were leaving behind, where they had no rights, where they were limited in the occupations they could have, where their religion was constantly being abused and they were being abused, where their worship was being abused, where the pogroms were killing them. They were leaving hell to come to heaven.
Orthodox Jewish families poured into America and into the Northland. Duluth's Jewish community grew from the turn of the century by more than 3,000 or 4,000 by 1930.
It was very common in those days. A fellow wanted a Jewish family. They wanted to start in business to open up a little grocery store. That's where the mom and pop stores originated. It was easy. Sometimes they'd many of them lived in the back of the store. In the front, that little area, they put a counter there, flour, bread. There was one on this corner, one on that corner. I think at one time there was at least 40, 50 Jewish-owned grocery stores.
Israel Orakovsky opened up his watch repair shop in Duluth's West End. Abraham and Telly Rubenstein had a fur business in Gilbert. Belle Zimmerman was a teacher in Ashland. From a small boat, the Goldish family sold supplies to sailors arriving in port. The Jews were spreading out all over the Northland.
There are Jews in Gilbert, which is 4 miles from here. There are Jews in Aurora, the entire Iron Range, International Falls, Ely.
4 synagogues were built on the Iron Range, 2 built in Superior. There were synagogues in Duluth for Reform Jews, Orthodox Jews, Conservative Jews. Theaters in West Duluth showed Yiddish movies. The Jewish community thrived. But it wasn't an easy life by any means. Sometimes the land of milk and honey was unforgiving. The Goldberg farm didn't survive the Great Fire of 1918.
Oh, yes, I remember. And like when the fire was coming, my dad and my mother were milking cows, and the sky was just all red.
In America, at least in northern Minnesota and Wisconsin, there were no pogroms, no killings, no persecution. There were spots across America where there was anti-Semitism, even as close as Minneapolis, where occasionally for jobs, Jews need not apply. The melting pot of the North was a relatively tolerant one. Anti-Semitism was pretty much kept to the schoolyards.
We didn't have much trouble like anti-Semitism, so to speak, but there was a little rift, you know. The Poles were called Polacks. The Jews were called Kikes, Shinis. The Italians were called Wops. You know, there was all kinds of immigration in those days, and they were just they weren't said in a mean way, you know. But that's the way the kids referred to each other.
It never bothered me, and I never gave it a second thought. Just took it for granted. I played with the Finnish kids, Slovenians, Italians, whatever nationality. We never talked religion. We moved next to the Catholic Church. We had our own cows at the time, and my mother used to make cheese, and a priest used to yell over the fence, Mrs. Siegel, I remember this vividly, can I have some cheese? He says, it's just like the cheese I had when I was in Europe.
Well, there was a difference as far as the religion, but we were always neighborly and always helping each other.
When I think of how they used to taunt us in the old country when we were kids, throwing rocks at us, at least we don't have that here. They may turn around and say, look at that Jew, you know, and stuff like that. But over in the old country, there's some Jews, let's get rid of them.
However, there were problems. Most Northlanders were immigrants themselves, and when some of them came to America, they brought much of their old world intolerance and bigotry with them.
There's one thing you got to remember. When you talk about Jewish history, you have to remember that there were many, many doors closed to where the Jews could go or what the Jews could do. So they got into enterprises that was open to them. You never saw Jewish bankers, you know. You never saw Jews working in utilities.
There are problems. I know my mother had great problems. She was a social worker. She was stationed out. She had a number of homes out on Garfield Avenue near Michigan Street. And I know the story. There was a church somewhere out in West Duluth where the priest used to get on Sundays, and he would give his speech and basically lie and tell his congregation that Jews would slaughter our children or have blood slaughter for blood offerings, which is completely false, and that we killed Christ, and that we continue to do this with children, like we're somehow getting indigent children and killing them when nobody's looking. And that would foment hatred. And I know when my mother, she was on foot door to door for all these people she had to see as a social worker, and I know one time she was chased by people, this is back in the 1940s, who were throwing rocks at her and saying, get the Jew, get the Jew.
When the Orthodox Jews came, they brought their belief, their culture, and their language. That language was Yiddish, a hodgepodge of Old German and Slavic written with Hebrew letters. Mr. Karen of the Northwest Iron and Scrap Metal Company took in his accounts in Yiddish. Parents spoke Yiddish at home, but always demanded their children to learn English. Home life to the Northland Jews was much the same as everyone else's. Adults worked hard in the store, on the farm, some went out hunting. Children played the same games as their non-Jewish neighbors, but there were differences. Friday night begins the Jewish Sabbath. For Orthodox Jews during this holy day of rest and meditation, there is no work, none at all. Electricity cannot be turned on. Food must be prepared the night before.
They kept Sabbath. They had services here on Friday night and Saturday, and you were not allowed to ride in a car or open light switches or turn on gas. And
Now and then on the Sabbath, Jews got some help. A non-Jew, a neighbor perhaps, would work in the store or on the farm, even in the home that day, and keep things going.
I remember distinctly, I had a lot of friends at that time. Gentile boys. We used to do everything together. And I said to one guy, you come up and on Shabbos and turn on the gas and light the fire and everything and ask for a dime, I says, and then you and I will split and we'll go to the movies. So they did the work, but I still got half of the benefit.
Did your parents ever find out of this? Or?
I think so.
Some other things defining Jewish culture are the faith's dietary laws. In the cities and on the farms and in homesteads, keeping kosher was a part of family life. Food had to be prepared according to strict rules. Cattle and chickens had to be slaughtered in a certain way and by a special person, a shochet.
You go to the corner butcher, and the man is called a shochet, a slaughter. And you'd even go buy a live chicken, and you bring it to the shochet, and he would slaughter it for you and pick the feathers. And
On the Iron Range, there was only one shochet, and he was in Chisholm.
There was a streetcar that connected all of the range towns. The steel companies put this streetcar system in. And this woman told me, you know, you never took the streetcar on Friday. I said, well, why wouldn't you take the streetcar on Friday? She says, you just never took the streetcar on Friday. She said, well, you know, these Jewish women would get on Friday morning with these live chickens, and they'd be all going to Chisholm, and this guy would slaughter them, and then they'd be coming home with these dead chickens after they were slaughtered. And she said it was terrible. You either had the stinky dead chickens, she said, or you had these squawking live chickens. So you never took the trolley on Friday.
It was difficult when we went to somebody's home. We couldn't eat everything they had because many of them had pork and we're not allowed to have any pork products, and the meat had to be kosher. So I never ate when I was invited to a school, a fair, and they served meat. I just tossed it on the side and I'd eat the vegetables and ice cream if they had it.
Keeping kosher was very important to the Orthodoxy, but many Reformed Jews weren't as strict.
None of the Reform families kept kosher homes. It just wasn't part of the family ethic or religious ethic for the Reform families to keep kosher.
They did not keep a kosher home. My father liked bacon, especially on Sunday night.
There was a strong need for kosher food in those early years. Phil Scher's grandfather started his own meat market in Duluth, supplying the area with kosher and non-kosher beef.
I know they used to have, way long ago, where UMD now is, used to be cow pastures, farms. And I know they would go up and buy cattle up there, and they would take a tripod, and they go, hope I don't get caught by the EPA for this, but we're talking in the 1800s. They would take the cattle over to Chester Bowl, Chester Creek, and they'd set up a tripod, and they'd slaughter the animal up there because there's water, see, and you can wash down the animal and keep it clean. Brutal work. They would load up meat in the back of the wagon, and I understand one of his routes was Proctor. So he would set out in the morning, and this is in the wintertime when it's 20 and 30 below zero, you know how Duluth is. And he would clip-clop all the way up to Proctor, where he would knock on people's doors in little stores, a lot of little corner markets. Hi, I'm here, what would you like? And the man would say, well, I need a side of beef, or I need a round. And if it needed to be cut, he had to go out in the wagon, and he'd take a saw, and he'd saw down the meat in the wagon.
Not all Jews lived according to the faith as closely as they should have. Duluth was a growing city that had its seedy side, and some Jews lived in that darker world.
Although we had a so-called, you might call them a mafia, the gang, but they weren't like the Purple Gang in Detroit or the gangsters in New York. But sure, we had them. We had brothels, we had Jewish madams, we had Jewish pimps, you know, and the hell. The crap shooters, gambling back of the in the alleys, and shoot pool, and pool sharks, and oh sure, they all came from nice families.
A lot of Jews got involved in bootlegging, and then ended up owning liquor stores when Prohibition was repealed.
Like now, Duluth in the first decades of this century had its have and have-nots. Duluth's Reformed German Jews were generally more well-to-do than their Orthodox counterparts. Many of those Orthodox Jews lived in Canal Park. It was not a beautiful neighborhood. It was poor.
There was a large Jewish community down there, and eventually, one by one, they moved up between First Street and Second Street, and there were a lot of little homes in the alley there.
Well, the Barg was on the hill. It was about 3rd Avenue, 2nd Avenue East, and 9th Street and 10th Street over to maybe about 6th Avenue. And they had their own little shops there, grocery stores, butcher shops.
Despite their philosophical differences, the Jewish community bonded together. They formed organization after organization. There were youth organizations, women organizations. There were labor groups like the Duluth Workmen's Circle. Individuals, too, would leave their mark. Smiles still grow on people's faces when they remember a woman named Ida Cook.
Ida Cook was married to Moses Cook, a very, very observant Orthodox family. Ida Cook has the reputation of being really a tzadika. It's called a righteous woman. She dedicated a great deal of her life to charity, very active in the instrumentation of the sisterhood here, and was very concerned about education. So she was one of the real guiding forces in making sure the children of this congregation, and then later throughout the whole community, would have a proper Jewish education.
Ida Cook was devoted to children and to their education. Her determination established the first Hebrew school in the Northland, the Talmud Torah.
She was the matriarch. Is that what they call it? Matriarch. She was a wonderful little lady. And if you needed a little help, she would give it to you. If you're a little short of cash, she would hand it out to you. If you needed food, she was right there to see that you got it.
Men and women were kept separate in Addis Israel Synagogue on 3rd Street in accordance with Orthodox tradition. When she was too old to climb to the balcony where the women were, Ida Cook took her place with the men, nearer to the Ark, the only woman to do so at that time. Ida Cook lived to be near 100. Another mover and shaker was Duluthian Irene Paul, a voice of labor and socialism.
My cousin Irene Paul became very active as sort of spokesperson for the radical community, and anytime when anything involving Russia was in the news, the newspaper would call up Irene to get a statement. What does she think? You know, they'd quote some banker, what some banker said, and then they'd quote on the other hand something with Irene, how she looked at it.
Meanwhile, the prosperity continued. Although some businesses collapsed during the Depression, others were born. New restaurants opened up, like the Flame and the Crystal Terrace. The Northland's Jewish population kept rising and rising. But there were worries. Many Northland Jews still had families in the old country, in Europe, in 1940.
Now, when we left Europe in 1921, we left an awful lot of relatives there. We had a lot of relatives there. And every one of them was massacred or burned, sent to the ghetto, you know, to the gas deals, or with pogroms, they knocked them off. We don't have a single relative.
What I remember about Greece the most is the color of the water, the Acropolis, the walks to the Acropolis. I lived very close to the Acropolis, about 2 miles, and we used to walk from my house to the Parthenon.
In 1941, war broke out in Greece when Esther Akos was about 5. Immediately, Athens was turned into a world of hunger and hiding and fear.
One of my most vivid memories is on a Passover night where we were all sitting around having Seder, and the sirens rang, and we had to drop everything and go to the ditches, and had to come back and finish Seder.
She and her family hid from the Nazis in the home of a non-Jewish widow. Esther Akos would survive the Holocaust. Her mother and her sisters would too, but her father would not. He was caught, sent to Auschwitz, and was one of the millions who would never see their family again. Later after the war, the remains of Esther Akos' family would come to Minnesota. Today, Esther Akos Winthrop lives in Duluth. She tells children her memories of life and death and survival, hoping this chapter of history will never repeat itself. In the late 1940s and 50s, Jewish refugees from Europe were again welcomed into the Northland. The Jews in the area helped out the newly independent state of Israel by shipping clothing and food to that needy country. And although on a whole, America was prosperous, the power of the Northland economy was fading. Slowly but surely, people went away, and the Jews of Duluth, Superior, and the Iron Range, en masse, went as well.
There was nothing here for them. The big openings and opportunities were not in Duluth. They were in Minneapolis, Chicago, New York, and California, and that's where most of them went.
Economic opportunities were less. The steel plant closed. The cement plant closed. A lot of those job opportunities went away. And the Jewish population started drifting away just as the non-Jewish population did.
So what happened? They graduated school, went away to college, never came back. So every family lost their kids.
It was an exodus, and very few of them actually ever came back to practice law, medicine, dentistry, or whatever they went into.
Once they leave, it's very difficult to get them back because the educational, and I'm talking Judaically, the educational opportunity is now gone, the socialization with others who have your belief are gone.
When I started Jefferson School, I was 8 years old, 8 or a little over 8, and the first thing they taught me is Duluth is located at the head of Lake Superior with a population of 120,000 people. 1921. Today, what is it, 80? There you are.
The population became older too. As many Northland Jews passed away, some other Jews left the faith or intermarried. Today, the community numbers just a couple hundred families.
I think change is part of the Jewish means of survival. I think we've survived because we're willing to change. And that Jews are moving to other areas means that Jewish life hopefully is increasing in other areas of the country. I don't think it means that those Jewish communities are dying. I think it means that they're moving.
B'nai Abraham means the sons of Abraham. It was built in 1909.
Many years ago, there were 4 synagogues on Minnesota's Iron Range. Now there is only one. This is the last synagogue left, B'nai Abraham, the most northern synagogue in the state of Minnesota. But it may not survive to see its 100th birthday. The small brick structure on South Fifth Street needs a congregation. And the caretakers fear if the synagogue doesn't have that family, it will soon be removed from the Iron Range landscape. Virginia's remaining Jews have trouble gathering a minyan, the 10 men needed for a service.
To conduct a service, you have to have 10 men present. There's only 4 or 5 Jewish men left in town. Practically everyone has moved away or died.
Virginia's Jews are doing their best to keep the synagogue going. During the High Holy Days, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the Jews' most holy day, the congregation asks men and women as far away as the Twin Cities to come. But on other days, even on Sabbaths, B'nai Abraham is dark and empty. When about 100 Jewish families lived around here, this was the meeting place during Sabbath, during bar mitzvahs and weddings.
I would just tell you that I was named here, which is the same, very much the same as Christian baptism.
But I remember when I came to Virginia to live and practice medicine, at the high holidays, the synagogue was packed.
To the 10, maybe 15 Jews left in Virginia, B'nai Abraham is still the house of God, and they hope the light here won't be lost forever.
I've seen a lot of changes. As a little boy, let's say 4, 5, 6 years old, this place was full. So I'd sit on my father's lap, and after, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes, Dad would say, "You're getting too heavy." So I'd go and ask my grandfather who sat in the row, my mother's father who sat in the row in front of us, "Can I sit on your lap?" Well, he was already an older man. No. So I'd go up in the balcony and sit on my mother's lap, and I'd get too heavy for her, so I got kicked around a lot. It was not a strange or uncomfortable place to me.
The Yiddish word for synagogue is shul, from the German school. To Jews, the synagogue is a place of learning and growth, as well as a place of contemplation, God's school. And this is the Third Avenue Shul, the Orthodox synagogue, Addis, Israel. It's been here for almost a century, but like many others, it may not survive much longer.
My father's uncle, a great-uncle, Shop Karen, who came over with his grandfather, Five Asher, the story I got was, took a train ride down to Chicago, where he'd heard of or had some connections with some Jewish people who had blueprints to a synagogue that had existed in Poland. And when he went to Chicago to get those blueprints and came back with those blueprints, which is what this synagogue is modeled after. So apparently, from what I heard, this synagogue is a near replica of a synagogue that had existed in Poland prior to 1900. I'm assuming since World War II it's leveled now. But when I was in Poland, I did go to a number of synagogues, and one of them looked very much like this one.
At the shul's center is an enormous ark that holds the Holy Scrolls, the Torah.
They commissioned Scott Graff Company, which is now out of business, but it was an old-time company in the western part of Duluth. I don't know if it was West End or West Duluth. And Scott Graff had a number of craftsmen who just did carving, wood carving. And so they would carve the figurines and all the different pieces, and they were brought here one at a time and assembled within the building.
Year after year, generation after generation, the 8-foot stained glass window has let the light of the world shine in. Once, when Duluth's Jewish community was predominantly Orthodox, many came here to worship. At one time, 100 families packed its interior.
In those days, strictly men are separated from the women. They changed to having mixed seating, meaning men with women, in 1971, and we've gone back to separate seating just this year, although we don't make the women go up in the balcony. If they want to, they certainly can. We've shrunk. We're down to 60-something memberships. We had maybe 55 for our holiday services. The older ones have passed away.
Addis Israel keeps many memories, memories of people gone, but not forgotten.
In our Torah, which is our Bible, we have a story of Abraham being commanded to sacrifice his son Isaac. Now, of course, it wasn't really intended for him to slaughter his boy, but it was a test of his belief. And as he was about to do it, God stopped him and said, "Abraham, you don't have to do this." It was more of a test. But this is a depiction of that event. It was made by needlepoint We don't know who the author was. It was found in a storeroom of my father's business. But this would be Abraham and Isaac, and here's the angel that comes down to tell Abraham he doesn't have to do this anymore. Shanas means in the Erev, in Jerusalem, Tafresh, Samek, Aleph, and I'd have to actually get a chart and figure out what year that is in English, but I believe it's around 1903.
A special yort site is preserved here from Superior's old Agudas Achim synagogue. A yort site is a memorial for people who've passed away. Nearby is a giant photograph of Addis Israel's past.
At the conclusion of one of our high holidays in 1914, apparently they assembled all the men who were in attendance, or at least a great many of them, and had them go upstairs in the sanctuary and crowd around and take a picture. This would have been in October 1914. Many of the founders of the congregation are here. I talked about my father's great-uncle Shopsy Karen. It's him. The congregation's cantor, who was an institution here many, many years, Cantor Braverman, was here. My own personal family is huge. There's my father's uncle, another of my father's uncles, my father's first cousin, my father's first cousin, two of my father's first cousins, another of my father's great uncles. All these are my family. This is our history.
Today, a legacy continues. Twice a week at the Ida Cook Hebrew School in Duluth, students learn Hebrew, religion, and what it means to be a Jew.
It means like you look at the Torah and read, and you sing all these Jewish songs to me. It's about ancestors and how we believe in our own God and how we worship God and how we believe God is someone.
One thing that's really cool is shalom, because it means 3 different words: hello, goodbye, and peace. So it's sort of like a greetings word.
A book you read at the Pesach Seder. What book do we read? Haggadah.
It takes several years of study, but if they work hard enough, the boys will be bar mitzvah, the girls bat mitzvah, ceremonies celebrating a coming of age and responsibility. In their secular grade schools now and then, they're bombarded with questions. What's it like being Jewish? What are the high holy days and why aren't you in school? Aren't you sad you don't have a Christmas tree? Like the Jews of northern Minnesota and Wisconsin a century earlier, and their ancestors for thousands of years, these young Jews are proud of what sets them apart.
I like being different because it sets me apart, and I like being my own person, and so it's good.
I like being different. So then I don't like to believe in Santa Claus or anything like that, like the Easter Bunny. I like to believe what Jews believe.
Sometimes they ask what I do and stuff, and I don't know, it's kind of weird because they think that I'm like a totally different person. Sometimes like when I first meet them, I know, they think I'm like a totally different person, but I'm not. It's just my religion.
When we get like Christmas break, like I'll be like talking about Hanukkah and everybody else will be like, what are you getting for Christmas and stuff. So it's kind of lopsided.
I am the only Jewish person in my class.
What's that feel like? What does that... Is it kind of...
Yeah, it's sort of cool.
It's also a blessing to be different, to be lifted up, to be the stranger, and that appears over and over again in the Torah.
As another century begins, a Jewish Northland perseveres, believing in its community, the power of its culture, and God.
It was very common, when you were growing up, that your grandmother or your mother would sing about Samir is gekommen a Cousina. That's Yiddish. Says to me, my cousin came over, Schön wie Gold ist sie gewesen, the grüne. Pretty as gold was this green immigrant, yeah. Beckerlach wie rote Pomeranzen, cheeks like rosy oranges, apples. Und Pisalach was beten sich zum Tanzen, and her feet, she wanted to dance all the time. It's a little Jewish lullaby, little Jewish song. Everybody, almost every Jewish youngster, not today's youngster, my generation, knows about the Grina Kazina.